I'd like to welcome Barbara Reid and thank her very much for joining us so late in the day for her. And we're delighted to have this opportunity of somebody who was really instrumental in developing the ideas about the continuum theory for records management to explain to the project a little bit more about continuum theory. So the way in which this morning is going to work is that Barbara's going to give us a presentation, followed up by some questions from myself and Anna Henry and Mark Hedges, and then we're going to open it to the floor for more questions. So thank you very much, Barbara, and I'll now hand the floor over to you.
Okay, great. Please interrupt me if you lose me. I can't tell this end. So I was merely saying I feel that I'm a little bit fraudulent in that I'm only one of many people involved in the records continuum, and the major theorist is Frank Upwood, who I will give you references to his articles before we leave the presentation. You'll notice that I called this Introduction to Record Continuum Thinking, and that's really quite deliberate. It's a way of thinking that I'm trying to convey to you, but I've decided to do this fairly straight. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is talk about the major concepts of record keeping continuum thinking, talk about the model, the most common representation of the records continuum, noting it's only a part of the more complex and detailed written continuum work. And then because it can be very abstract, I'm going to try and work through a case to see if that will help us work an understanding. I am going to, at the end, talk about other continuum models, hoping that they may help you explore this further. So that's the plot, and I'm aware I've got about 15 to 20 minutes by my understanding. I'll try and keep to time. I've just been at IPRES in Melbourne, and I wanted to say that the continuum thinking had a lot of resonance with some of the keynote addresses. Ross Wilkinson talked about the Australian National Data Service, and they have used the information continuum model as a basis of some of their work, and I'll show you some of that a little later. And Herbert van der Sompel's keynote address talked about exploring objects which are always in context, concepts of temporal coherence, and defining the reach and the boundaries of resources, all of which are absolutely spot on this type of thinking. So I hope that we can make connections. So some of the major understandings that I wanted to convey before we look at the model per se is that no record exists as a single object. It's always in the state of becoming. By that we mean records are essentially information objects in relationship to something else, the people who created them, the work that's going on, the organisation, other resources. So it's very much a rich model. It's not thinking of something that is continuously or fixed in time. So the notion of fixity is something that we need to deconstruct in record keeping, because the object is only a part of the story. So the phrase "in a constant state of becoming" is one of Suma Kemish's phrases, and essentially that's saying every time we do something with a record, whether that's a process that we apply to the record or a use of a record, it changes that record. It adds to the rich contextual nature of how to interpret that record. We know that the context of a record, or we think that the context of a record is as telling as the content. So this again is putting the emphasis not just on an object, a single resource, but this resource in context. And the metadata that identifies and documents records in space-time of creation and use is as revealing of its meaning as the content itself. So no record exists as a single object. It always exists in relationship. We can choose how much relationship or context we want to bring to the fore. There's choices all over the place about how much metadata, when that metadata is applied, for what purposes that metadata is applied. So we choose how much context is relevant, and that is dependent on where you're coming from when you look at a record, and how much you need to make explicit to those who aren't in your context. And the meaning of a record, therefore, changes constantly. So at the moment, we're having a big debate in Australia, I presume it's worldwide, about the metadata surrounding phone conversations over the net and surveillance. So what they're coming to, and they're telling us, oh, don't worry, we're not keeping the record, we're only keeping the metadata. And of course, that's totally, in and of itself, what is of value to us. So in record keeping continuum thinking, what we are understanding is that all of these things are implicit all of the time in the record, whether we choose to privilege them or not. And age is not relevant. A record is a record is a record. It can last for a nanosecond or it can last for a millennia. The basic concepts are the same. It's a choice about how we manage it. I'll try and explain that a little later. So what we in this model, in this thinking, talk about is that actions and activities on records, using records, with records, around records, take place in many different places. So I've called that the locus of action or space. Can be in a single institution, can be outside the institution, can be many different parts of an institution or in the web. And it also takes place at different periods of time and across different periods of time. So that concept that there are multiple places, multiple locations of action is what is referred to as the space-time dimension of the continuum thinking. And the other thing is we are asserting that all information resources can be managed according to these understandings. So you don't have to manage things as records. You don't have to manage them in exactly the same processes, but the understandings can be applied to all different types of information resources. And whether you choose to do so or not depends on your own need and the requirements and the capacity. So it's very much dependent on what we're trying to get out of managing the resource. So we're beginning to write around record keeping informatics, which is trying to push these understandings right down into data and to other areas. So we think that the record keeping thinking is applicable or can be applicable to every information resource. So the model is the most obvious and most familiar representation of the records continuum. I am going to go through it very quickly. It was developed primarily as a teaching tool at Monash, and it's really a tool to explain or to enable people to uncover complexity. Essentially, we were reacting rather violently, I suppose, to the very simplistic notion of life cycles, which is a very linear progression. And in this very complex digital world, those concepts of linearity are limiting in what we can do. If you start to think according to the way the continuum thinking, the actual model disappears. It disappears into the way you do it, so into the intuition of practitioners, into the strategies you apply, and the tactics and the methodologies you might adopt for specific tasks. The model allows you, and in fact you must, position yourself in order to understand how you are interpreting the model, and I'll hopefully explain that a bit more. I just also wanted to, before we get to the model, say a few extra things, not on the slide. It's a scalable model, and hopefully again I can show you what I mean by that. That is to say you can change your focus, and that changes the way you interpret the model. All dimensions apply simultaneously, so that it's not linear, and again I'll try and explain that. But it is a model, because it's a records model, it talks about, it's based on transactionality, things happening, activities happening. So The model, I'll change the slide. The model allows you to talk about how records are stretched into new shapes by linking and aggregating them by the patterns that form them. It allows discussion of multiple lives in space-time as contexts and their surrounding use and management of records alters and open up new threads of action. And again, I'm going to try and illustrate this rather than just state it to you. And it does embrace this notion of continuous recreation. Records are never stable and fixed. And if we think they're fixed objects, that's a model that doesn't allow the complexity and the kind of flexibility we need, we think, in the digital world. Okay, so now I'm going to quickly, I hope, run through the model itself. I've used a deck of slides that are quite old. I hope they work. This is kind of the target model. You may have, if some of you have seen this model, you may have noticed that I've got rid of the cross hatching. And in fact, Frank Upwood would get rid of all of the lines. But then it's kind of difficult to explain a model with no lines. So I've left some lines, and I'll explain why and why they work and why we don't do or don't like them. So here we go. This is the model in all of its complexity. And essentially what it does is identifies key evidential, record-keeping and contextual features and puts them in relationship to each other. What it's trying to do in a one-dimensional way is to represent the multi-dimensional nature of the record-keeping function and to really fix the practice of record-keeping against these key points. But there are many ways of reading the model, and none of them are wrong. They're all perfectly correct. But it's non-linear. You can do a linear, I'm going to get this pointer to work. You can do a linear representation by tracking out. Some people get obsessed by these labels and try and fill in a value for each of the labels when they are talking about a particular case. I am absolutely not interested in that type of reading. It's too narrow. It doesn't help us. It doesn't give us the complexity and the flexibility we need. But we've got to start the explanation somewhere, and all explanations of this model end up sounding linear. I'm just going to keep saying it's not intended to be linear, but to explain it, I have to go in a linear way. Perhaps I can show you this. This is a paper folding tool. I don't know whether you use them as kids, a fortune-telling tool. And if we think about the model as one of these things, so the axes kind of fold up on each other, bringing different points into well, putting different points adjacent to each other, allowing different interactions and different kind of manifestations of issues to be explored. That's kind of a better model than the flat one-dimensional one that we ended up with on paper. Other people have tried to represent it as a kind of double helix, floating in space, suspended. All of those are better because they convey the notion of three-dimensionality and movement, whereas the model on paper kind of doesn't. So we'll take that as read. Let me run through this. It's these are the dimensions. The dimensions of this model seem to apply to any type of information resource. The record-keeping particular things are in the axes. So if you change what the axes are, the proposition is that these dimensions will apply to anything with a particular information focus. So the dimensions are, I'm going to run through them and show you them in some detail quite quickly, I hope, excuse me. Here are the lines back again, and I'm really leaving them here. Oh, I'm pointing with my mouse. These are the lines back again. I've left them here to show you that this actually is in the center and there's other dimensions outside this. So in this dimension, this is the messy dimension in here of creation. And it's the data, it's the transaction that's happening. This is the place where the record is first conceived of, first drafted. It's the place where we really only have actors working together, creating some type of trace of an act. This is called archival documents because the proposition here is this proposition that a document can last for a nanosecond or a millennium. It depends how you manage it and how robust you build the controls in and what controls you build in. But everything has got the potential to be kept as or to be an archive. So we're not making a very strong distinction between archives and records. But here we're talking about the dimension of document control and control processes, document management, the messy stuff on your desk, the horrible stuff in your desktop, all of those types of records. Very much an area of formation, very much an area of action. So all action takes place in this inner first dimension of create. Dimension 2 is the capture dimension, and it's really this is where the lines get a bit tricky. We pass over a boundary from dimension 1 into dimension 2. And to some extent, you can think of this as moving into the capture dimension. When you move into the capture dimension, the record needs to be accompanied by more formality. It needs to go into some type of system of management, needs to be available more broadly than just an actor. It needs to be understood as evidence of activity. They are what we call records, and if they're records, they should have the characteristics that records have. The boundary crossing stuff is why Frank would really love to get rid of all of the lines and circles, because the boundary crossing stuff happens at different times. The boundaries are porous. It depends on the circumstances. So you can do a reading where you can flip from one dimension to another without any fixed and fast boundaries. But for the purposes of explanation, we have a creation dimension. Oops, I'm using the wrong pointer. Have a creation dimension here in the middle where all the messy stuff happens, and then we flip to a capture dimension, which is a little more formal, where it can be used by more than one person to record their activities, acting as evidence, records acting as evidence. So beyond that, we move into the organized dimension, and the organized dimension is essentially, well, one way of looking at it is to say this is the resources of an organization. And organization doesn't necessarily have to be, an institution, an organization. You can work out and choose what you want to call the organization. Could be a community of practice, could be, a joined up collaborative project. So again, a little bit of flexibility. So at this dimension, again, we're aggregating from the capture dimension into the organized dimension. Typically, rules get applied in this dimension. This is the dimension of the archive, meaning all of the records of an organization, however you want to define that. A set of single or set of rules that have been defined for the functioning at that level, and we're building organizational. Or if you're an individual, this is the individual memory as well. It goes beyond organizations as such. So here it's where, in a typical records management, which is not a phrase I use very often, but in the records management world, this is the realm of setting up your internal regime of management. How will we do this? What rules will we apply? What classification schemes? What migration strategies, what storage strategies will we apply at the organizational level to push in on the inner dimensions? In some cultures, the archive singular would be called the fond. I don't, perhaps record group, I get a bit iffy about British archival practice. Yeah, okay, so, oh, hello. The last dimension is the pluralized dimension, the fourth dimension, and here we're talking about a very broad space which goes beyond the organization. So we're talking about archives in the plural, typically aggregating again so that the resources of more than one organization, however defined, collect into some institution. Again, a typical reading would be an archive such as PRO in the UK collects or gathers together the archives of many organisational archives. And it does it for a whole whack of purposes. But this is more than that. It's also the dimension of social impact. This is where laws and regulations are set that apply to multiple organisations. This is where we define, I suppose, the broader social reach of a record. And it's the social and cultural context in which record keeping takes place. In this space, and we could interpret the World Wide Web to be in this space, okay, huge notion of an archives, but we could do a reading that said that this was the web. In this space, and also in the third dimension, I'm going to go back to the third dimension. These are almost the rule-setting dimensions, which apply then to the inner dimensions, which are more about the process of formation. And we can also, using this type of model and this type of thinking, envisage multiple ways of interpreting events and records. So we can manage the notion of alternative conflicting narratives. There's a really good example from our Australian literature to talk about this. The technical term is simultaneous multiple provenance. But essentially what it's talking about is there are more than one stories that can be told. And if you are an asylum seeker coming to Australia at the moment, the government would interpret your actions as, or their actions to stop you as being border protection or national safety or something. But the asylum seeker, who is also the subject of the records, may well interpret that function as refuge or as, a human rights violation. So the model can embrace multiple different readings of the same events. Okay, quickly I'm going to zap through the dimensions because this is really the record keeping space. And as I say, if you change the labels on the axes here, you can read it for different communities as well. So this one is the representational trace. This is the evidential axis, using the wrong pointer, evidential axis. And what it's a degree of formality. We have something that's fairly messy. There is a trace of it. It exists, might not be beautifully managed, might not be managed well. In order to make it evidence of activity, not evidence in a court of law, but evidence of activity, it needs to push out into the other dimensions in order to become more broadly a component of organisational individual memory. Again, it pushes out and then it goes into the collective memory space in the fourth dimension. The identity axis really is about capturing the people and the institutions involved in the transactions. Who are they? When did they act? What mandates did they have? What delegation did they have? How do they impact? Here you'll probably, if you're familiar with sociological theory, understand that Frank Upwood took the models from Anthony Giddens' structuration theory, and this is really, this and the transaction axis are really representing a view of structuration theory. So here we have actors, individuals, people who are doing things, units, organisations and institutions. And again, I'll show you, I hope, how scalable that can be. And then the fourth axis is the transactional axis, which is really important for records because records are all about transactions and acts. It's usually two sides, but we have a kind of taxonomy, if you like, of pretty well established purposes which cascade out. We acts, activities, functions and purposes, so it cascades out. Did I get to all of them? No, the last one is the record keeping axis itself, sometimes called records container axis. So we don't particularly want to limit the thinking about what these things are, but nonetheless they cascade out. So we've got this messy thing that's capable of being a record. We need to add metadata and processes around it to ensure that it can act as a record. In order to act as an archive and organizational or institutional memory, it needs to have more formality. It needs to be broader than just the understanding that was created by a limited number of people. And similarly, as we move into the archive space, it has to resonate with a much broader general population archives. We have to think about what we need to do to this thing in order to make it accessible from the general public. Now, I'm just really conscious of time, so I'm trying to be quick, but there you go. I'm putting the model back together again now. And I thought I would try and illustrate this using a case, and I've chosen a case that was easy for me. Probably got nothing much to do with you, but I'm hoping there are enough things that I can explain using the model with this case. So this is an extract of a ward file for a woman called Jenny Elliott. And essentially, this is the admission record of this woman when she was a child. She was how old? I can't tell you how old she was because I don't know. Well, yes, I can. She's about 8 months old at the time this record is created. And she was taken into a state institution. So I'm going to tell you a number of stories around this, trying to use the records continuum model. Now, just bear with me because this may or may not work. Okay, here's the records continuum model. So let's tell the basic and the straight story. The transaction, the action that takes place is that this poor kid, poor little baby, was admitted to a home called a Lambie. And I think if I push this, I can get a cunning representation of a Lambie. That's the Lambie home. In the 1960s, this is the context of children in care. So there's, on the record, we can see it's not created once. There are many actions happening here that are recorded on the record. Let me go back. This is going to be awkward. Go back. You see there's not, wrong pointer, not just one, there are multiple entries on the record, different handwriting at different stages, different processes for creating the record. The record is not fixed and static. It's created continuously while that person is there. But all of this is taking place in and around this dimension where the unit is probably the admission unit. At some point or other, it's going to move out to here, and the organisation will become the Lambie Children's Home, which was a reception centre for the kids who were state wards in Victoria. So just let me get away with assuming that one document represents a file. Obviously, there's going to be many different pieces of paper on a file, but for the point of the exercise, let's just assume that all of these actions are being cumulatively aggregated into a file, which is kind of happening here in these two dimensions. The card sequence that documents all of these actions. So now I'm talking records. I'm talking records, and down this line here, the card sequence is part of a bigger set of records which relate to the records that are held by the institution. There will be many different types of records in that institution called a Lambie, the organisation called the Lambie. Now, a Lambie only lasted from 1960, well, it lasted for 30 years, from 1960 to 1990, at which point it ceased to exist and the records were given to the parent department responsible for administering the records, which was, in this case, the Department of Community Services in Victoria. We don't really know enough, just looking at a straight record, to interpret the actors, but we can tell a story nonetheless about how these files came to be created. There's enough evidence on the record to be able to recreate forensically what was happening. What we do know from this record is that it was never expected to be made public because it was created in 1963, and at that time there were no, this was a very closed process. Children's records were very sensitive, if you like. the way records were created were never created for public access. But if we go back, we can see that there are comments on this card here, for example, which says "gorgeous little girl." Well, that's great for Jenny Elliott, but let me tell you, some of the comments that are on some of these records are not "gorgeous little girl," but they're actually defamatory, and they're pretty horrible, and they're very judgmental. There are judgments about families. There are really unsupported things in these files. It was a different time. It was a different place. Very judgmental. There weren't record-keeping rules per se. So over time, we kind of need to interpret some of these comments to understand how they came to be, and then when we're looking at them subsequently, how to understand them. So let me then tell you I wanted to talk about scalability. You'll note that I positioned a Lambie in that tail here in the third dimension. Another reading would say actually the Department of creating responsible in Victoria could be the organisation, because there's a bigger archive here in the Public Record Act in Victoria. The public record is the archives. So then the department becomes the organisation, and a Lambie becomes one of its operating units. So we can change the focus, you can change the reading depending on where you position yourself, making it quite a flexible model. Okay, now let me just move on to now, and what we've got now is a very, very different social environment. Very briefly, I'm sure you all have similar things. The whole attitude to children in care has changed. In Australia, we've had 12 major inquiries across states and nationally. We've had apologies to children in care. We've had national and state apologies. We've had all types of things happen. We've got a Royal Commission going on at the moment. So the environment in which we're looking at child ward files has changed significantly. The department has gone through 6 structural changes since 1960. So it's gone through different organisational putting together according to the different rules. The laws have changed substantially. There's been 2 laws, and that would be out here, the two different sets of legislation, actually, sorry, 3 different sets of legislation that govern this function over the period. And we've got freedom of information, we've got privacy protection, we've got a whole lot of things happening there. We've got international conventions around the rights of the child, so that the environment has changed substantially from what it was in the 1960s. So how do we then look at the record? Let's just think about the record we had. It's an image of a file. So what actually happens is Jenny Elliott, way back here in the kind of action arena, applies to the department out here for access to her file. So she somehow has to interrogate the mechanisms of government and find out who's responsible. She goes and submits a freedom of information request. All action happens in this centre. The organisation here being currently Department of Human Services, and the unit responsible is called FIND. They will administer the getting of the record. So they will in fact put together the records relating to this person in care. They will get them from their own, from a Lambie, they'll get them from their own records in the department, and they'll get them from the Public Record Office, which is out in the 4th dimension. They'll put them all together and they'll create a new record. They'll image them, they'll digitise them and create a record, which they then give to Jenny Elliott, who's actually now changed her name, of course, a lot of issues around that. So you can see that this record has got at least, well, there's many, many trajectories it can go on that we could explore. But the image itself is one of the trajectories. How did it get to be where it is, and how on earth was I able to find it to use it? And the answer to that is Jenny Elliott, having received her file and constituted her own individual memory of that up here, then made that image accessible to the collective memory through an exhibition in the National Museum of Australia. National Museum of Australia. So again, another trajectory out for that record. So the layers of interpretation are really quite substantial. When you're out in the collective memory space, particularly for records like this, particularly where you've got a major change in social attitude, regulations, no record can stay, well, it's a bad idea to have records that are uncontextualized. They need a contextualization so that these comments, the way they were created, can be understood by someone who's coming to this record. So what I'm trying to explain there are things like scalability, changing meaning over time, different semantics, different needs to contextualize records at different points of time, transactionality, many transactions, many interpretations. You can use this model in a very flexible way. That's my major case study. I hope that kind of makes some sense. So we actually followed 4 different sets of actions through my little wiggly pointer here. I wanted very briefly to say, oh, here we go, look, pictures. Moving on. You can use this type of analysis for anything. I'm not going to go into WikiLeaks in any detail, except to use it as an example of something that has been radically ripped out of its context and made available in the collective space up here on the internet outside the normal protocols. So you can go from dimension 1 to dimension 4 without needing to go through each area. On the other hand, I could tell you a story about Bradley Manning and how he came to have access and how he came to, write the copy the files and the processes of WikiLeaks to actually authenticate. And what's really interesting, if we think about it just as a trajectory from 1st dimension to 4th dimension with nothing much in between, is the need to contextualize. So that's really what I wanted to use this example to point out. This, which you can't see, of course, but is in fact a very sophisticated searching tool with any number of criteria on which you can search, and underneath here, again, you can't see it, but there are lists, there's pointers to, if you wanted to find out how to interpret lists of people involved, lists of protocols. This not only allows you to search, but also then points out to different ways that you can get access to how these records were constituted and what they mean. Different ways of presenting, so visual analytics to, again, make it easier to explore and to add stuff, different communities coming in to add user interfaces, if you like, into the records, not only by one organisation solely responsible for doing this pluralization. And this is an example of the type of thing that has been developed to actually explain the detail of what each major code in the records means. So this is kind of like a key, a codex or something, to explain how to read the cables. So there's all different ways of pulling this information together, and the notion that this belongs only to archives is not holding up in the distributed network environment in which we live. And the analysis, the records continuum model as an analysis tool allows us to do that type of analysis in all types of environments. Okay, look, that's what I really wanted to say about the records continuum. I wanted to just say that there are a number of other models, and I think I alluded to the fact that the Australian National Data Service has used this one, the information continuum model. And you'll see it's exactly the same, but the axes have changed. And this one might be more appealing to a multidisciplinary project than the records continuum as such. But again, it uses the same basic thinking that I've tried to go through. I don't think anyone's particularly wedded to this. I don't think Frank would worry if people change the axes. But what we've got is a technology on one side, how to explain technology that is capturing data and where it lives. We've got a categorization access, which is really about the meaning, and this is the metadata stuff, the metadata that you add and contextualize, and how do you need to contextualize something that's going to always be living in a globalized domain. That's quite different from what you might need to do if it's just me sharing records with the person who sits next to me. It's about the reach of the record. Action structure, very much like the records one, and storage memory, just like the records one too, because they have to be recorded somewhere. There has to be systems associated with that. To kind of nearly finish up, this is in fact what the ANDS guys, the data curation guys, have done with the information model. You'll see it's a very different presentation, but really think about these as, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I've lost you. I'll just continue. I've gone off and clicked some, oh, here we are. Sorry, I'm back. They think about these as the circles, the domains, the capture, create. So this is the private, that would be in the first dimension, the shared would be in the next dimension, next probably 2 dimensions out, and the public is in the 4th dimension. And these are kind of boundary issues here. And in this instance, in this model, they've used them as migration processes, because in order to change domains, they've defined you need to have particular interventions. So look, the 2-second go through the records continuum model and record keeping thinking, but here's where many of these resources can be found. So these are the people who were members of the record keeping Records Continuum Research Group, and a lot of the papers are up on that site. And at that point, I hope I haven't exceeded my time too much.
That was terrific. Thank you. We're just going to switch off the speakers here. Yeah. Okay. Lovely. That was really wonderful, Barbara. Thank you so much for such a terrific introduction to the Records Continuum. What we're going to do now, and I'm going to do a time check with Christine. How much time? Because we started so late. Okay, we're okay. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to Anna Henry, who is the Digital Preservation Manager for Tate, who's just going to kick off some questions.
Hi there, Barbara. I think we've been thinking a lot in terms of digital artwork about constant change, and I think that's why we start sort of looking at the continuum model and the concept of a record being in a constant state of becoming is really relevant, I think, for artworks as well. Just thinking about relating that to a sort of preservation practice. I think whereas continuum theory is thinking about preserving a record that might still be in active use and changing in terms of the record itself and the context of that record. OAIS, which is the most common preservation framework, seems much more based on a life cycle where a record is no longer in active use and transferred to the custody of a repository. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether you see those two models as being incompatible, or how, like, what impact the continuum theory has had on preservation systems and frameworks.
So I don't think the continuum theory has had any impact on the OAIS model, and for that reason I don't particularly like it. I mean, it's good for what it does, but if you talk to anyone who's in the archival space, they'll tell you the OAIS model only takes you to this point, that there's a lot more work that needs to be done to actually manage records in context beyond what the OAIS model will allow initially. So let me just get off my chest why I don't like the OAIS model particularly. Firstly, it's custodial. It's based on the notion that everything has to be brought into a third party in order to be preserved, which I think is not the reality. Records are preserved all over the place. So record keeping thinking involves storage and places of storage, but it also embraces what we call post-custodialism, that is beyond the notion of a single entity. In that interpretation, the role of pluralized dimension may be to point to or to contextualize something that is held somewhere else. So I think it was David Behrman who very famously said, yep, custody is great, someone should do it. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be one place. So I do think the digital preservation community is thinking a little bit custodially. That's the answer. Well, it might be the answer, but there might be other answers. The other thing I don't like about the OAIS model is that it doesn't, I think, embrace that notion of continuous change, of the fact that all of the actions you do impact upon the thing you're trying to manage. All of that's embraced in the notion of the administrative layer, and I find that to be a simplistic reduction of the complexity that we actually have to manage. And it also only relates to those things that are in this custodial space. So I find it to be quite limiting in that. It does, of course, and as it matures, or as the implementations mature, I think all of these things are coming to the fore. But it is what I heard from the DigiPres community in Melbourne most recently was almost entirely focused on custodial thinking, and that may be the case. It may not be the case. Things can live in the wild. In terms of the continually changing format problem, which I think, and degradation, and do things operate as they were designed to operate? I mean, they're the challenges, and from a record keeping point of view, where I think they hit the road is where we think about when things have to cross these boundaries, and migration as a process is a really emerging boundary crossing issue around formats, I think. I don't know that I've answered your question, Anna, but there you go. It's a go.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That was actually really interesting, and it's Pip here who's back. I'm the head of collection care research at Tate. I'm afraid we've lost our webcam, but we can see you. And one of the things, I know you were at iPres and actually listening to the idea of things being in a constant state of becoming. I think Michael Craig Martin's artwork, Becoming, which was presented at iPres, could be the poster child artwork now for continuum theory, so that's excellent. But we're very interested, I mean, it's so interesting for us to hear what you were saying about OAIS, because I think from an arts museum perspective, where we've tried to be good troopers and understand better the models that are coming out of the digital preservation community, it's always been extremely difficult for us to fit our relationship to contemporary artworks, which increasingly are conceived of as evolving and being part of the, a changing active life, often with a number of editions which are developing different biographies. So it's been extremely difficult for us to then fit that type of activity and the rhythm of the museum and the degree of change that we see into models like OAIS. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts. I know you saw Patricia and Ali's presentation on their work with software-based art, but I just wondered if you're aware of anybody doing any work with the records continuum theory about thinking about contemporary art conservation and how to sort of conceive the life of those active artworks within your model.
The answer to the simple answer is no, I'm not aware of anyone applying the model in an active space. So although there are discussions, I think, and we need to be more involved in those discussions, so that's down to us as a community, with the art community, we haven't done it well or enough, certainly from my Australian perspective. So I can't point you to models. But I think there's a number of things that the presentation by the project at IPRES brought up. One of which was very much interrogating the intentionality of the artist, and particularly where they're fragile and volatile software. I think the point was made that the artists actually end up fiddling with the art as it's there, so it's actually evolving in the exhibition space. There's the notion in some digital art of, I can't remember the phrase, and I'm sure you'll know it, but it's something like elegant or something degradation. So that's actually a part of the artwork. If the art, what does the artist want in relation to that? Will emulation, will showing it as if it was done on a Mac 4 be sufficient for the artist? Do we have to actually keep the machine? That's getting us into space that, from an archives and records perspective, we thought, there was a strain of thought talking about becoming museums, and I think in the American practice it's a little stronger than in the Australian practice, where we would not do that. We would not look at keeping the original machine, but if we needed that machine, it would be an emulation. So I think what this is saying, what the digital art world might be saying, and I don't have any expertise, but we need to have those conversations much earlier with the artists themselves to talk about the problems, I guess, of keeping digital art and how we would keep it. So the strategies of digital preservation, either as a part of the collecting exercise, as part of the exhibiting exercise, as part of the management exercise in an ongoing way. So I think what I'm suggesting is in the same way as records in the first dimension need to be set up so that they can last, or we can make decisions about whether they're going to last, that we need to have the same types of discussions with artists. Sorry, it's very unformed thought.
I think that's very interesting, because I think the idea, I think that's been embedded in contemporary art conservation for quite a long time. So I think there's a really interesting point of convergence between those who've been thinking about, and practitioners working with artists from the point of creation and thinking about what it means to steward a work that is evolving through its life while engaged in the active kind of conservation of those works. And actually, I think it's very interesting to see how there may well be a point of convergence with the records keeping thinking, and some really useful cross-fertilization. So thank you for that. I'm going to pass over now to Mark Hedges, who's our project coordinator. No, so hold on a minute, and he's got an additional question. Can you get one head?
So just look at my head on.
Yeah, she should be able to.
Can you hear me? Just nod if you can, or something.
Yes, I can.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up if you can hear me. Yep, okay. I'll take that as a yes.
Yep.
Okay, I wanted to ask a question about going from a sort of research data point of view, because one of there are two main sort of areas in our project in terms of the type of material and stakeholders. That's tapes, artworks, and so forth, and also we have research data from space experiments. And I actually used to in the past work in sort of research data curation. I suppose say mostly humanities, but not entirely. So I want to go back a bit to an example which we had when I was working in research data management, because I think it's quite relevant to this. We followed a very custodial model where essentially a research project at the end of a project, we get a whole load of stuff deposited with us at the end of what you might, its active life cycle when it was being initially created and initially used as part of a research project. It became clear to us that a lot of the information that's useful, even essential to understanding this data completely or fully, or was only available, had been lost at this point. It was only easy enough to capture this while the data was being created, so by involving yourself to an extent in the researcher's actual work. And to give you a sort of scientific example, we did some work with, there were biophysicists actually. Essentially what they did in very brief terms was they get some images from, well, for example, crystal diffraction patterns or something like that. I don't really understand the details. They do lots of processing on with various tools at their desktop, and they'd end up with some end data sets which would be published. But there was a lot that they'd sort of made deposit this end data set, but what was lost in this custodian model was an understanding of what they were really doing. As you said, you mentioned different narratives. I mean, during this processing, they'd be going through different threads and dead ends and backtrack and find things that didn't work and so forth. Which is useful for future researchers, but also for things like teaching these sort of processes. So again, it seems very clear to us that the model here, what we ought to be following in this case, was that we bring the curation activities back in time and embed them in the researcher's work process to the extent we could, and we actually did some sort of research around this. And this seems very analogous, although completely separately, from the sort of continuum work. If you think of the various information that these researchers were generating on our desktops would be, what do you call it, representational traces, for example, which were sort of discarded and didn't really serve as evidence to go up to the next sort of dimension of what had actually been done. The only thing that was sort of deposited as evidence was this end result. I was going to ask you, actually, if anyone had been had taken the records continuum model and had sort of adapted it for this sort of more data curation activities, and you've very kindly shown us the ANDS model. I mean, I haven't actually had time to sort of look at that. Obviously, I just saw the slide come up, so I haven't really had time to examine it in relation to this sort of scenario. But I just wondered whether the sort of scenario I described has for you any resonances in terms of the records continuum way of thinking. And it's also very relevant to this project because we've been looking at tools for sort of capturing this sort of live context. So it'd be very interesting how one might model that more theoretically. What do I do now?
It certainly has resonance. In the record keeping space, so I'm going to flip because I don't know a lot about research data, although it's a huge thing in every country. But the parallel in records is managing records as end products, and that is you get them at the end. And really that's, I guess, one of the primary drivers for developing this model in the digital world. So it's it was always a convenient fiction that there was an end product and they were papers in boxes on a shelf. But if you deconstruct it with a bit more knowledge of what's going on, that paper record actually embedded the processes, and you could read the processes in the paper record, and you could tell stories about that. Now, we're not trying to invalidate that, but in the digital world, what we have to do is actually make those processes, make those connections explicit, because they are not going to last in the same way because they haven't been built into the processes. So in our community, what we found was that when we automated, when we moved to the digital world, we brought the paper practices, but we didn't bring the paper. The object ceased to be like the paper. So we lost what was embedded in the record, and we couldn't actually articulate it. So we had to re-articulate what it was that was so important about what was embedded, or what was able to be read from the record in the paper state. So there's that. And the other thing is what you're describing, embedding the curation in the work process is actually a record keeping. You are doing record keeping when you're doing that, because what you're doing is looking at the acts and the activities that's going on and documenting them in relation to the way the data has been formulated. And I am sure I don't need to tell you about all of the work that's been going on around work processes and how to document work processes and how to link work processes to the data that is the product of those, and be able to interpret that product in relation to can I replicate this data set? Will I get the same results if I do the same things? What would I need to do? How do I trust this data? They're record keeping issues as much as research data issues. So again, I think there's a really big confluence of communities who are beginning to understand that just managing as an end product at the end is actually not helping us to make things live for as long as we want them to live in a pluralized space, in a very complex world. So I would absolutely see resonance there, and I think I perhaps alluded to some of that in the keynotes at the IPRES conference last week. Things like temporal coherence. If we look at something from now, do I actually have the same meaning as when it was done at the time of its creation? How do I test that? Have the words changed, that semantic shift or drift or whatever you want to call it? What do I need to actually surround that object with? How far out do I need to surround it from the time it's created? And that's going to be different for each different type of data set, I would argue. It may be that, so there are many different ways of being custodial as well, and the scientific community always strikes me as a particularly interesting one. The World Meteorological Organization has an interesting model. Yes, it's custodial, but everyone chooses to contribute their records to a centralized repository, which is actually, it's almost a community-driven thing, and it's clearly an important community, but it's not an archive in the sense of that we would think of it from the archives and records, and yet it's most definitely a social archive. So the scientific communities are kind of doing it themselves to some extent, and I think we need to work out how that's working. But I don't know a lot about it, but I think what they've done is very prescriptively defined the metadata standards, clearly articulated how those, whatever it is that's being deposited in the central bank of data is contextualized. I know that some of the research communities here are talking about things like persistent provenance. So when we mesh data from different places together, we can pull them apart and work out where they came from. Different levels of trust, different levels of authenticity, depending not on the data itself, but on the things surrounding the data. How did it come to be created? Are you reputable? Do I trust you? So I think there's a huge amount of resonance, Mark.
Lovely, thank you very much, Barbara. I've got, and thank you very much from Mark. I've got one question from Simon Waddington at King's, so I'm going to hand the microphone over to him. I think we'll take a couple more questions. Is there anybody else in the room who wants to ask a question? So if you raise your hand, you might have to come over here, but I'm just going to hand you over to Simon quickly.
Hi, Barbara. I hope you can hear me. You mentioned in the last couple of sentences issues of sort of quality, authenticity, and trust. And one of the advantages of OIS I can see is that there are lots of standards for like trusted digital repositories. You've got maybe a trusted third party that's managing your data. And I wonder in this records continuum approach how you address those issues of quality and authenticity and trust.
So very tricky question. Thank you. Thank you. Records have, in order to be a good record, okay, anything can be a record. If you actually have the characteristics of records that have been established as a standard, the characteristics are, I'm going to forget some of them, so please feel free, Anna, to jump in here, but it's integrity, authenticity, reliability, and usability. You build those into, I don't know whether my presentation, but you build them into this. The characteristics of records have to be able to prove those. There's some tests. They're pretty limited and they're organisationally defined at the moment. But nonetheless, those are the characteristics of a record. By taking things out of the context of creation, by moving them from system to system, by moving them from place to place, as we do that, so that's around the migration processes, a lot of those issues become assertions rather than hard and fast rules. So in the record keeping sphere, the process of migration or conversion to different formats has to have with it enough information around that process so you can test whether you think the characteristics apply, have been carried forward, what the extent of loss is, what the extent of degradation of the data is, those types of issues. From an archives perspective, in many ways, traditionally and as an ongoing role, archives have been authenticators. So if something ends up in the archives, almost the institution gives it authenticity. So authenticity as an assertion, not as a thing. So if something comes out of an archives, it's going to be by definition more trustworthy than something coming off Facebook or Pinterest or Flickr. Now, is that a reasonable thing to say? Well, I think archives would assert that that's part of their role. I'm not sure that they've really reconceptualized what it means to be the holders of authenticity, and I think other institutions can do it. So a system is only a part of an authenticating mechanism. I would argue that the OIS model is good in that it says that it's bigger than a bit of technology. And the trusted digital repository type certification and checklists and things are certainly getting there in terms of being able to test or somehow have some documentation around whether a repository meets these standards. So certainly I think that's what that's for. Yeah, it's a question of layers as well. If a trusted organisation, so what does that mean? Yes, that's a very messy question, asserts that this is okay, do we trust that organisation? And can we therefore take on trust a whole lot of things? Or are we questioning the processes and the robustness of the processes? Yeah, I'm not so sure where I stand on that. But to go back to your question, authenticity, reliability, integrity and usability are actually characteristics of a record. It's down here. So again, bringing them much closer to the point of creation. I don't know whether I answered your question, Simon, as usual, flustered around, but I think there's more that, I don't think it's a complex question, and I don't think certification of a repository is necessarily the only measure.
Thank you very much. You couldn't hear Simon, but he was saying yes, that was very helpful. We're very conscious that it's getting very late for you, Barbara, and I think we could carry on, but maybe I'm very glad that you're on our steering committee, and thank you very much for the time you've taken, what is this evening for you. I think all of your comments and your presentation are going to have enormous resonance for us as we conduct our meeting here in Liverpool over the next couple of days. So I think there'll be a big kind of cheer from the, thank you very much. And thank you for all your support of the project.
Well, thank you very much. It's been fun, and I think the resonances and the intersections, the cross-disciplinary collaboration is fantastic. Why reinvent the wheel? We really need to be working together. If I can contribute in a very small way, I'm delighted to do so. So I'm very pleased, and thank you for inviting me.